Those of you who are joining us on YouTube, and welcome. Um, we are here once again to see if we can't get some more information about this walk, which obviously it has changed so much. It has gone from this Sunday morning sitting in a pew, listening to a sermon and hearing an altar call at the end, maybe singing some songs at the beginning, to this massive infusion of knowledge and a new kind of energy and all these things. Well, in that process, we also have many things to undo, to unseat. And I think this is a really good, um, I think this is a really good and healthy change in the reality of Christianity. And I don't consider myself to be somebody so important that somebody else isn't doing it, but I haven't met anybody yet who does do it, who doesn't end up in some sort of realm of like kooky, um, anti-establishment type of a thing. And I want to stress that what I would like to do is find the unity, find the balance, right? Oftentimes, what will happen is we will learn something new and we will become excited about it because we experience something. We experience the activation of the law of emet, or the law of truth. And the law of emet is simple. It has to do with harmony, resonance in terms of energy, and it has to do with just kind of this thing that we might call an unction. Some people say it's hearing their shepherd's voice, but there's this moment where it's like that is exactly true. Like that is there's no lie in that. One of the things that I learned early in the beginning of this deconstruction that occurred with me was that no one has ever died for a lie. Okay. Now, there's some ways that we could go about expressing this. I am just going to take an object and kind of demonstrate the premise, okay? But let me talk a little bit about cybersecurity. So in cybersecurity, oftentimes what we are trying to do is make something more secure. So the way that we do it is we overwhelm the system and then see where things flow out and then plug those holes. Um, that principle is present in a lot of things, right? For example, let's say that you have a inflatable swimming pool and there's a leak and you can't find the leak. Well, the only way to really know where that leak is at, right, is to overwhelm the system with pressure and find where it's flowing out at. The same principles present in a tank, in any type of vessel. Okay. And so that concept then starts to move in the direction of trying just to figure out where are the little loopholes, where are the little exceptions, as it were. So in cybersecurity, one of the things that we do, or that we have to do in that situation, is we have to breach the security system. And in that process, the way that we do it is we usually, there's a number of different ways. There's a man in the middle attack where we actually intercept signals before they reach the system and insert our stuff into it. And also we can potentially get passwords, credit card numbers, etc., as they're coming through. And if you can get a credit card number from a company before it's passed through, then there's an encryption problem and we need to fix that. But generally speaking, the way in which we usually are able to infiltrate a system is by delivering what we would call a payload that looks legit in some sort of data packet. And then when it's delivered into the system, it becomes a backdoor type um, of program that basically writes some code into the registry, and then all of a sudden our program is running in the background. Nobody knows it's there. And then all I have to do is go in, get onto a terminal, and go in, and I have infiltrated the system. Well, it's interesting because in the grand scheme of things, there is an element of that present in this process that I'm about to speak about. But what you need to know is that we have this idea present within us, whether you are an atheist, whether you're a Muslim, Christian, whether you're a Buddhist, whether you're a Hindu, a Native American, all of those faiths contain something that causes a person to feel an unction towards allegiance. Now, let's talk a minute about loyalty versus the law of truth. Okay. Let's say that you are a child and you were raised in a country, or you were raised in a culture where you are given a certain set of faith tenets and given a certain set of ways of thinking and cultural practice. Remember, all culture is attitudes and behaviors mixed into a balanced process, and that distinguishes you from another people. So it causes a people to become distinguished, is what culture is. A practice of culture is a lifestyle. Okay. A lifestyle is a habitual practice of culture. Culture is attitudes and beliefs, or I mean, attitudes and actions that cause you to become unique as a people. Okay. So in this principle, when I said no one has ever died for a lie, let me illustrate for you. There is a certain sect of Judaism. There's a certain sect of Islam. There's certain sects of Christianity that have a policy or a thought process of a necessity to activate violence in order to create chaos. And then that chaos then can be solved through institutional influence. Okay. In principle, it's to scare people into submission, as it were, or what we call today terrorism. Now, that does not encompass the entire set of those faith sets. And believe you me, there's some even in other groupings. There's even some atheist groups who have a violent area of their groupings. So when we're dealing with this, the whole principle is that no one actually is, like, for example, if we have a suicide bomber, or we have somebody over here who does some sort of act of violence, they're doing it because they believe that they are supposed to. Now, that can be influenced by what? By loyalty to the culture. In other words, you're a child, you were raised in it, you believe in it, you're an overachiever, and you're going to do exactly what your parents taught you, do exactly what your city taught you, right? But the truth is that for those who have actually become these religious fanatics, or for those who have actually stepped into the realm of um, extremism, religious extremism, they didn't do it because they're just loyal to a cause. There's too many different personality types for that. There's one personality type that will attach itself to a cause if they feel that it is loyal, or if they feel it's worthy of loyalty. But a majority of the personality types do not do that. So what is this thing? Well, it's this payload. Let me explain how it works. I'm just going to use an object here. This just happens to be female to female HDMI adapter, but it's just this little square object, which will very easily illustrate my point. So this is absolute truth, okay? Let me explain to you how absolute truth works. Remember that the intensification of all power in the universe is a source, okay? A source that emanates and is reduced in intensity as it emanates outward. So as it moves further outward, there is a reduction in intensity, and therefore there is an ability for, as things are further out from that intense source, to exist at a lighter level. When I say lighter, I mean less weighty level, and I dropped it, a less weighty level than the rest of the source, okay? As a result of that, anything that proceeds from that, right, which could be perceived as something that is being emanated through speech, or what we would call sound vibration, with the influence of how the tongue and the lips move together in order to form words. Yes, we could go there. But the truth is that the intensification of all power in the universe is not anthropomorphic. What does that mean? It does not have any hands. It doesn't have a gender. It doesn't have a it doesn't have feet. It doesn't have eyes, ears. It doesn't have a nose. But for the sake of this realm, height, width, depth, time, in which we are the most superior species and we are the most powerful spiritual beings. In fact, one could argue that we actually are not what we see here. This is actually an illusion, okay? I know that sounds off the wall, because when you break your arm, or somebody cuts your skin, or you get some sort of a nail in the foot, or a thorn catches you on the arm, there is a moment where you realize that you are very, very much human, right? But that principle is not necessarily the true reality of this emanation. Well, what's interesting about that is that if there's any type of intention or thought, and again, that's anthropomorphic, right? Anthropomorphic. But, and this is important, that's the only way we can do this. It's the only way we can understand it. We need diagrams and illustrations and algorithms and all those things, because we're just finite in a lot of ways. When something proceeds out from that, no matter how far out into the emanation, it is still it, okay? And so if there is some sort of intention or expectation from the intensification of all power in the universe, no matter how far out into the created cosmos, let's call it, as no matter how far into the cosmos it goes, it is still recognizable as the source, however diminished it becomes. Meaning what? There is an absolute truth. And that absolute truth has a tendency to actually have a resonant energy that is recognizable for those of us, which is everyone technically, those of us who actually are the emanation, right? What does that mean? That means that truth is recognizable within us because we are also that truth. I know that sounds a little bit off the wall, but you need to remember that there's no limitation, there's no formation, and there's no expectation present in the intensification of all power in the universe from our perspective looking in. From our perspective looking in, we have a father, a husband, a son, a king, a priest, right? We have these things that we would understand from a Hebraic culture, not a Greek culture, not a American culture, but a Hebraic culture would understand shepherds, priests, etc., right? Well, in that process, then what we have is we have this ideal present, that all of those things are just familiarities for us, But the truth is there is no limitation of gender or limitation of form. There are no hands. There is no mouth. But it does say what? Man shall not live on bread alone, but every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Well, when we think about the creator of the universe as being this intensification of all power in the universe that emanates creation out from itself, and as it does, there is a reduction in intensity so that creation can exist, because if it resonates at the same frequency, no, if that's even an accurate way to describe it, but let's just go with that. If it resonates at a certain frequency, it's it. It is the intensification of all power in the universe. So any matching of that frequency would then what? Would just be it. That'd be done. You would just be the intensification of all power in the universe. So there needed to be a reduction in order for there to exist something that resonates at a different frequency. All right. All that to say that there's an absolute truth. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. You can take an absolute truth and you can wrap a bunch of information around it that doesn't necessarily agree with that absolute truth, and somebody will still believe that fluff because this is the payload inside. Okay. And so really, this is the thing that lets everything know that it's true, but then they just wrap all this around it. Okay. That's what we would call subjective truth versus objective truth. The principle is that when you hear your shepherd's voice, this has to be present. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a bunch of this wrapped around it. Now, in some ways, that could be detrimental in the process, because then we start get into what? The deceiver, right? We start to get into the iconic Christianity's Lucifer or Satan, right? But the truth is that in some cases, there is an element where this actually has an importance, in that there needs to be something subjective, but it still needs to be provable that it's from him, as it were. Okay. In other words, sometimes there's instruction that we can't handle. This is the instruction we can't handle, but we could handle this instruction. Okay. And so this is inside, making sure that you say, oh, yep, that's definitely my source. That's definitely source. Right. But all of this is just because you can't handle what's actually here. So those are the two kind of ways, and there's probably more, but those are the two kind of ways in which all this works. Well, the reason why this is important is because there are often times where we experience a watered down truth, as it were. So like when I go back to my illustration of this person sitting in the pew on Sunday morning, and they're listening to a sermon, and there's music maybe at the beginning and some worship, and then after that there's a sermon, and then after that there is a closing and maybe a call to the altar, and that is the typical Christian service. There needs to be a realization that that in and of itself is a culture that is established by what? Attitudes and actions that make that people unique. But that doesn't necessarily mean it is this. Remember, nobody's ever died for a lie. You strap a bunch of explosives on your body and you walk into some place and trigger it. You probably had this somewhere with all of this. In other words, there was something present that made you trust the source, and then somebody wrapped a whole bunch of fluff around it and convinced you to do it. And I can tell you, I have actually sat down. We'll go ahead and we'll go with Islam. And the reason why we will is because obviously in America, there is a general fear of Muslims because of what happened with 9/11. Let's dispense with the conspiracies and let's just go with the general fear of Islam. But the truth is that's actually a very small sect of Islam that actually practices those things. And there is a whole entire other group of people who are loyal to their culture and somewhere along the lines experienced this. Now, The reason why I bring this up is because what I'm trying to kind of show you is that there's an agreement in vibration, frequency, energy, whatever, however you want to look at it, when it comes to actually experiencing truth. Okay. That all was necessary for you to get the idea that there is a common thread present in humanity throughout the cultures. We won't call them religions, we'll call them cultures. Because why? Because there's a set of beliefs that have to somehow contain this with a bunch of this, right? And I'm not saying, oh, well, mine doesn't. What I'm saying is that when you identify this, then you have identified that frequency that's just understood as absolute truth, which can trigger you to go off in a certain direction because there's some semblance of that absolute truth present. I promise you, the people that went down to Jonestown had this, but somewhere along the lines, they had this and this and this, right? I mean, like we could layer falsehoods around this and deliver it as a payload to your heart, to your mind, and that little tinge. Because let me tell you what the law of truth does. It instantaneously activates trust. When you hear your shepherd's voice, when you resonate with the oneness of the universe, however you want to look at it, when you are in prayer and you drop into a place where you are in just total connection and feel, for lack of better words, the intimacy of that source. In other words, there's an unadulterated thread there. And now somebody comes along and sounds like that. Why? Because there's some a little bit present, right? And then they have a whole bunch of fluff, and you're like, that doesn't jive right. Like there's this feeling inside of you of dissonance instead of resonance. Okay. And as that dissonance occurs, you're like, that doesn't really sound true. But I hear something there, and next thing you know, you're drinking Kool-Aid and going night-night. So the principle here is that no one has ever died for a lie, right? Okay. Now, all of that is important because of what we are going to discuss today. Remember, and this is kind of relevant, is that in general, we try to kind of look at the parashas, as it were. But in this case, I'm just going to go really quick to the First Fruits of Zion website and show you it is now BeShalach. BeShalach is Exodus 13:17, okay? Exodus 13:17, BeShalach. Now, the reason why I'm bringing that up is because BeShalach is the actual parasha that mentions the wilderness season, the waters of Meribah, etc., all of the things that are present after the Exodus. So if we were to timeline this, we're going to go what? Exodus, Red Sea, wilderness, Sinai, right? Exodus, Red Sea, wilderness, Sinai. That's it. Well, this is actually a warning of what's to come. Because why? Because we're about to drop into the actual Passover. Remember, I told you last week, or maybe it was the week before, we have begun, as we stepped into Shemot, which is what? Which is the section of Torah that the Christian theological people who established the canon called what? Exodus. Okay. But the truth is that Torah is all one book and there's just sections. Well, the section of Shemot, or the section of names, begins what we call the Passover season. Now, for those who are Yom Kippur and Easter Jews, which would be similar to the Christian and Yom Kippur and Passover Jews, which would be similar to the Christian and Easter Christians, this is going to be foreign to you. And the reason it's going to be foreign to you is because you're used to the idea that, oh, well, Purim finishes, I start preparing for Passover, is what it is. But the truth is that this season of Torah cycle drops us into Passover months before the actual Moedim occurs. When I say Moedim, I mean the spring feasts. The reason for that is because there's a necessity for preparation in a lot of ways, but then there's also a necessity to gain new insights so that as we're moving into the actual Passover, the eating of the food and the Seder, the Seder service, we are actually encountering the possibility that as we enter into that Seder service, we're going to have some new knowledge. And that's kind of the principle here. Now, there's a lot of things that go into this. Ezra is the one who divided up the parashas and said that this is when this is when you're going to read it, and this is the season that you're going to start it in, et cetera, et cetera. But in all of that process, Moses is the one who created the sections. Moses created the sections as a result of what? Mouth to mouth. Remember, the intensification of all power in the universe does not have a mouth. So this is an anthropomorphic way to communicate what? Oneness in the process of Moses' interaction with this source. And as he does, he writes down what he experiences, hears, however you want to put those words. It will not describe what's actually happening in the realm of energy, in the realm of forces, in the realm of creation, formation, in the realm of emanation. Okay? So there's a few reasons why this is relevant and important, but what you've got to kind of get your mind wrapped around is that the parashas fall where they do as a result of a design that kind of occurred over time, but seems to have its intention in the very beginning of Torah, in Bereshit, with Abraham, with Noah, with Adam. Okay. Why do I bring that up? Because now we are in what we would call the study or the preparation of the wilderness season, the warning that it's coming. Like, hey guys, if you forgot, this is probably what you need to do. You know how many times you're like, the pastor gets up and he's like, okay, mark your calendars for Sunday, the 28th or whatever. And then what we're going to do is we're going to actually, have something occur and, be excited about that, but mark your calendars, right? As a preparation, as it were, for that function of what's coming. Well, this is the same thing. Mark your calendars because why? Because the wilderness season is coming. Okay. But let's talk a bit about the wilderness season just in general. Okay. There's a couple things obviously that are important. The first one is obviously that we have a decline in physical comfort and an incline in spiritual intensity, right? How do we know this? Well, quite simply, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, it says that what? It says that he let them go hungry so that it would expose their hearts as to whether they would be obedient to his commandments or to his Torah, okay? To his teaching and instruction. Now, one of the more important elements of this is that process of what? Of understanding that this adversity of hunger, thirst, and the attack of the enemies, the Amalekites, was part of a grander intention from the intensification of all power in the universe to ignite or initiate or motivate an Israelite to do a certain action a certain way. Okay. All right. So now what we need to get our minds wrapped around is the idea of the wilderness season in the sense of what? In the sense of what is actually going on. Well, the wilderness season is where the bride has been chosen and she's now being prepared for the betrothal. There's a couple things that we probably need to discuss here. Let me go ahead and we will jump to the whiteboard and discuss them. Okay, so starting at the beginning, the first thing that we need to do is we'll go ahead and we'll just create some timeline points here. Okay, and so I'm just going to have this point here, and this point here. Okay, and in that process of having those points, actually, you know what? I think I want to do that one. Let's label these in red. Okay, so this point, of course, is what? Passover. This is the actual eating of the food. Okay, this point is what? This is Pentecost. Okay, and this point is what? This is Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, now we may eat the food at Passover, okay? But the truth is, until we hit this point here, we are still in the Passover season. But that's the actual feast day season. This point right here begins the what? The actual Moedim, the seasons, as it were, okay? The Moedim. Now, the reason why this is relevant, why I'm saying the actual, is because why? Because we are actually over here in the timeline even before Purim, okay? Because Purim is kind of the place where you're like, oh, geez, I need to go shopping for Passover, right? That's kind of what happens with Jews. They're like, okay, Purim's over. Let's go shopping for Passover. So we're going to put Purim here. Okay. But generally speaking, our parasha starts here, right? Okay. From this point to this point is what? Let's do this in a different color. This is the wilderness. Okay. That's the wilderness. So what? This entire section is the Passover season. However, this entire section is the emanation of the Passover season. What do I mean by that? We start studying about Passover in Exodus here, not at Passover. Why? Well, because that's kind of just how it's fallen together, right? That's over time what has finally become the agreed upon parasha sections, et cetera, et cetera. And this is when they fall. If you start the Torah cycle, a 1-year Torah cycle, here in Tabernacles, at the end of Tabernacles at Simchat Torah, right? Okay. So in that process, then what we understand is that there is this time coming that's the wilderness season. And one of the things that's happening in the wilderness season is we are being allowed to go hungry in order for it to expose our hearts as to whether we'll be obedient or not. If we are obedient, we experience a spiritual incline in intensity. If we are disobedient, we experience a physical discomfort. Okay? In fact, let's go ahead and illustrate that in different colors here. Because I want to definitely show a contrast between the two. So we have this spiritual incline occurring, right? And then we have this spiritual decline occurring. Okay. And the premise is that it's based upon this obedience that comes around this, is centered around this whole situation, which of course you guys know we have the cup of redemption during the Passover Seder when Yeshua said, take this and do this in remembrance of me as often as you do it, which is what? Once a year at Passover, not every, second Monday of the month or whatever. Okay. And so at Passovers, when we quote unquote take communion, and that is the cup of redemption. And Paul says that some people have gotten sick or died after they drank that cup. So it's a very fearful cup. But that begins the initiation of the obedience for the Passover or wilderness season. All right. Why is this so important? Well, because you remember the Passover is, let's see. The Passover is the choosing of the bride. Okay. Passover is the choosing of the bride. And so when we're working with this idea of the choosing of the bride, one of the things that we are doing is we are we're coming up with an ideal that she has to somehow stand out and be desirable. Well, that's that principle here of preparation. Okay. Remember Esther at Purim, right, is celebrated red or whatever. And what was her preparation? Recall that she went through a preparation of what? Herbs and spices that she bathed in daily for a year in order to prepare for one single encounter with the sovereign of that kingdom. And in that process, she was found to be presentable, and therefore the bride was chosen. Okay. So, in that sense, we view Purim as a preparation for Passover, and in that sense, we view the preparation or the idea of kind of dolling up or putting on our makeup or whatever, to make ourselves presentable or to make ourselves desirable for the choosing of the bride, so that the bride would be chosen. Remember, the bride is the corporate collective conscience of what? Of strong minds who have gone through the redemptive process of Yeshua HaMashiach, or Jesus Christ, and they are now in the influence of being able to what? To cause there to be a change in the cosmos. That's why it says in Revelation chapter 22, verse 17, let the Spirit and the bride say, come. Yeshua ain't going to come back until there's a bride, and the bride ain't going to exist until there's a corporate collective conscience that is all resonating at the same energy. Well, we can bring that up a little bit later because there's something more important present, and that is this preparation to arrive at Passover. Okay, so let's talk a minute about just the practical elements here. We'll jump out of this for just a moment. In the practical elements of this, what we have going on is we have what? You have a pilgrimage, a required pilgrimage to, because of David's choice of where to put the ark, Jerusalem, there is going to be a pilgrimage, and you could be all the way up by Lebanon or be all the way down by Egypt and still be in the borders of Israel and still are going to bring your butt to Jerusalem, and you're not going to come empty-handed. You're going to bring money in order to buy what? To buy anything your heart desires, including alcohol, meats, whatever, but you are also going to make sure that there are no poor among you. In other words, that you bring them up into equal status with you. That's the pilgrimage. And so you're 2 weeks out from that and you've got to make a 3-day journey. You probably are already done a lot of preparation to get to that point, right? Okay, so what is important about this? The idea is that even in this realm of height, width, depth, time, that where we are governed by gravity and we are governed by contours and lines and defined objects, there is an actual practice going on of preparation. Some of that has to do with what? The chametz, right? The getting the chametz out of the house, the cleaning the house and getting rid of the all of the yeast or leaven. And of course, Paul brings this up in First Corinthians chapter 5, where there's actually something that is pretty disturbing going on. There's a violation of Torah going on that they say isn't even among the Gentiles, which means what? They had never heard of this thing amongst the Gentiles. This is something that is actually just present in this congregation, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but the point being is he brings up leaven during that time. Okay, now here is the part that is important. When we are talking about the bride, we are talking about a corporate collective conscience. I can prove that through the study of Genesis 11. I can prove that through the study of Revelation chapter 21 and 22, etc. But in the grand scheme of things, the whole idea is that there's a very different kind of people, not in agreement of thought per se. We could even disagree on futile or frivolous matters. But as long as there is a legitimate, actual, energetic interaction, right? Then there will be that corporate collective conscious connection between each other. And then that is the bride of Yeshua, as it were. That is that singularity, as it were, of oneness. Okay, I'm sure that stuff sounds a little bit off the wall, but where I need to go with this is more along the lines of what is this thing that's happening? Well, at Passover season, there is a principle that all of the virgins get together and they get all pretty and they apply things that would accent their beauty and mask anything that would not be desirable. And then they go and they dance in front of the men who are single. Now, before we get crazy with this and think that we got like some pole dancing going on or something like that, it's an actual group line dance with fully covered bodies. And so the presentation is more in the gracefulness. The presentation is more in the natural beauty of the woman, accented in some way, by how she prepares herself with oils on her face, that type of thing. But the point is that then the groom will look into the group of women dancing and find the one that is most desirable. Let his father know that that's who's desirable. And then what happens? Then there is a shidukin, there is a matchmaking that occurs. There is a discussion between the father of the bride and the father of the groom, of there being a possibility of a coming together or a betrothal, which of course is what? Pentecost. Okay. So the season from when the choosing of the bride occurs to the moment of the betrothal is the Passover season, in which what? The intensification of power, all power in the universe's son chooses the bride, and she begins to negotiate with him concerning or the authorities or the higher or greater energies, then work on there being a harmony of agreement, so that what? So that these two other energies can be brought together and now can come into harmony and agreement and create a new energy, right? We've got inception, we've got reception, and we've got conception. Okay, so the relevance behind the choosing of the bride is that she masks anything that is undesirable. Okay, so what is the reason behind the shidduchin, and what is the reason behind the betrothal being so far out into the summer months? Because there's a maturation in summer, right? There's a maturity in summer. You say, you know what? These Jews got together and they made these holidays and they just scheduled them during times when there was good harvests and all that kind of stuff. Okay, fine. But the problem is that all of this works together. The turnings, the four seasons, the way in which humanity operates, the way in which Israel operates and judges, all of this comes together. And what's really crazy is when you start to get into the quote unquote gospels, right? When I say quote unquote, is because that's not what they were called, right? These are narratives and stories about Yeshua. I'd rather not call it a God spell. Okay. But the principle is in all of that, there is this idea of what? Of these energies and the action of energy. Okay. So we're talking about the wilderness season, though. We're not talking about the choosing of the bride. But what I wanted to show you is that the bride masks her what? Her defects of character in order to be chosen. And once she's chosen and taken in, there's this process of where all of a sudden, after she's chosen and taken in, that there's this waiting period. Well, what's going on during that waiting period? Well, there's negotiation between the father of the bride and the father of the groom for a dowry, which is a payment that basically compensates the family for the loss of the generational family name, in that when the girl is taken out of that family, not only are they losing a member of that family, and therefore there's a kind of a deficit in the family business, as it were, or however you want to look at it. But the whole idea is that there was a price paid for the bride, and that price was to compensate the father of the bride for the loss of labor, but also for the fact that she's now going to lose her family name and take upon herself the name of her husband. And so she'll go from being the daughter of Joseph to the wife of Ezekiel or whatever. Okay. Now, when we're working with this idea, the way that I want you to think about this is, now there's this idea of the father of the bride going, she's worth this much. And the father of the groom saying, no, I saw through that makeup and that stuff. She's got an attitude, right? Or she's been seen before talking with men, or whatever the accusation could possibly be. And then the negotiation is yes, but she has this going for her or whatever. And then there's the same things kind of going on per se with the son, but not as much, in the sense that it is the father of the groom trying to procure the bride for his son, not in the sense of property per se, but in the sense of what? Of being able to take her away from her family. Okay, so in that process, then there's what? There's an a discussion about her attributes. Well, this totally corresponds with the wilderness season. Why? Because Yahweh said, I let you be hungry, right? I let you be hungry for a season in order to show you, or in order for me to know your heart, or in order for your heart to be known, I should say, in order for your heart to be known whether you would keep my commandments or not. Because man shall not live by bread alone, but every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. I'm sorry, and to teach you that man shall not live alone, but live off of every word that comes out of the mouth of God. Okay. Now, the reason why that's important is because when we start to come into the wilderness season, what we're going to see is what? The exposure that we could hide during Passover, the exposure that we could hide during Passover of our attitudes, right? And behaviors, words, right? And so when we're talking about this, the thought process is that beauty will be accentuated. That is the spiritual incline in intensity, and defects of character, or even what we could call malevolence is exposed that we didn't really realize was happening. That's during the counting of the Omer. Now, why does this occur, and what is going on? Because when we arrive at betrothal, we'll arrive with one of two attitudes. We'll arrive with the attitude of the gold digger, as it were, right? The wife who has the intention to only benefit from the groom, as opposed to the one who's going to come and try to give to the groom. Now, there's a whole nother study that goes into that, because obviously we cannot give anything to the intensification of all power in the universe unless we give to a lesser, because remember, Yeshua said we would always have the poor among us, and if you do it unto the least of these, you've done it to me. Okay, so when we are discussing this, now you can understand that there is actually a compare and contrast of what? Attitudes, behaviors, and words present in the wilderness season. Why is this important? Because that's this week's parasha. What do they say? They say, God brought us out of the wilderness to die. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. So the first thing that's important is what happens. The first thing that happens is they go to what? The Egyptians, and they get gold, silver, precious jewels, robes, and, goods, as it were. All right. Maybe livestock. We don't know. In fact, it's probably not livestock, because the Egyptians lost their livestock in one of the plagues. All right. So at any rate, now they're heading out. They're heading out of Egypt, and they are heading towards the Red Sea. No one yet knows this whole thing. But what's important is what the first verse of BeShalach says, okay? So here's how we're going to go about this. First of all, we'll just go ahead and pull up the parasha and read from it real quick. It says, when Pharaoh finally let the people go. In the Hebrew, that is in the sending away of Pharaoh, right? God did not lead them along the main road that runs through the Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said if the people are faced with battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Thus the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. Okay, we're not going to get much more into all of that, except to say that it was like an army ready for battle. We'll go ahead and drop that in there. But now what I would like to do is go over into Judges chapter 3, and this is what it says. These are the nations that the Lord left in the land to test those Israelites who had not experienced the wars of Canaan. He did this to teach warfare to generations of Israelites who had no experience in battle. These are the nations. What's the first nation? The Philistines. Meaning what? Between this verse right here, in verse 18 of Exodus chapter 13. So God led them roundabout through the wilderness towards the Red Sea. Why? Because he didn't want to take them the way of what? The Philistines. So we have this idea of maturation here. They are not ready yet for the Philistines. But by the time we get to Judges chapter 3, that's one of the nations that's going to teach the generation who did not take the promised land how to make war. So here's something interesting about that. And that is that his concern was they might return to Egypt. Well, there's a couple things that are important about that, but the short version of this is going to be that Mitzrayim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. I'm not going to break it down on the board because that's a whole lot of parsing and a whole lot of explanation that is just going to be extra information that you don't necessarily need. What you need to know is that it's in the dual, which means there's two. You need to know that the actual Hebrew word matzar is the Hebrew word that means limitation or the binding of something, to wrap something around something and bind it and keep it bound. Okay. And so there's a bondage, as it were, in the word Egypt, but it's a dual bondage. There are two limitations. Okay. So the whole idea is he says, I don't want them to go to the Philistines in order for them to because if they experience war, they may return to their limitations. Well, this is that idea of putting on the makeup, as it were, and masking the defects of character. Okay, because the idea is that this preparation for the choosing of the bride doesn't work well if you walk into the dance and your hair is disheveled and you have torn garments. You're not as going to be desirable as the one who walks in adorned like she's ready to be a bride. Does that mean that she is being deceptive or evil? No. This is present within her. It's just at this moment, all of this is irrelevant. It doesn't play a role yet. Eventually, we need to arrive at this without this, right? But remember, they can't handle war yet, right? They cannot handle war yet. Meaning what? Meaning he's going to lead them in such a direction where what? They will not have to experience or do war. Okay, so then that gets us to the Red Sea, right? Now we're walking what? Up to the Red Sea, and I'm sure they're like, man, we don't even know what we're doing here, but okay, camping by the sea ain't a bad deal, and it's got the beach, right, and everything. And all of a sudden they realize they're in a box canyon, a kill box, and here comes Pharaoh and all the rest of the chariots of Egypt, those who didn't die, right? There's this moment in Exodus 14:14 where the intensification of all power in the universe communicates to Moses to get up off of his feet and to take the staff that he has and to stretch it out over the sea, and all of a sudden the sea is going to part, right? But what does Moses say to the people? He says, The Lord will fight for you. You have only need to be still. So there's this moment in time when there's nothing they can do. There's no options available. And now what? Warfare is upon them. Well, they can't return to Egypt. Why? Because Egypt is now coming to them. In other words, their bondage, right, is now coming towards them. And so he takes and he brings them through the Red Sea, brings the Red Sea back over his bondage, right? So there's a mikvah, there's a baptism, and this is what Paul says, all were baptized, right? And so as they pass through, their bondage is washed away, right? The Mitzrayim are washed away. Then they come into what? The area of the 7 palms and the fig trees and all that, and they sing this song called the Song of the Sea, in which in the Song of the Sea there is a design or balance. Now my scroll camera is broken, and so as a result of that, I can't really show you the scroll and show you this section of the Song of the Sea. But if you go to BeShalach from last year, you can definitely see that, where I show the Song of the Sea. Okay, so now as we go through this Song of the Sea and this celebration, and what do they say? They say, the Lord is a warrior, Yahweh is his name, or Yahweh is a warrior, Yahweh is his name, okay? And so we see that warfare is kind of the theme here. But as they start to leave the 7 palms and start to come into the wilderness, what's going on? Now, all of a sudden, there's this grumblings, right? Who will give us water to drink, right? There's no water here. God brought us out into the desert to die. There's no food here. God brought us out into the desert to die. And finally, they are attacked by the Amalekites. That's this entire parasha. But what's important is the fact that this is a discussion not about leaving Egypt. That's a given. That was actually last week's parasha, in which the Passover occurred, and there was a passing over of the homes that had the blood on the doorpost. And the purpose and intention behind that was that there was a condition created for every single person present, for Egyptians and for Israelites. The angel was not going to distinguish between Egyptian and Israelite. He was going to distinguish between who was obedient to the instruction to put the blood on the doorpost. Whole nother study, whole nother relevance. In fact, you can go back to Bo of last year and see that teaching. But okay, so here is the principle. The principle is that as they moved into the wilderness season, now all of a sudden their hearts are going to be exposed. And what? He brings manna, water from the rock, and he brings about a protection through a very specific action of the prophet Moses, where there was the raising of the hands and then there was the dropping of the hands. The raising of the hands, Israel prevailed. The dropping of the hands, Israel did not prevail, but the Amalekites prevailed. Okay, now, where this becomes important is in the stripping away of the stuff, okay? So let's go to the board and let's start talking about this a little bit. The principle that we want to get to here has to do with the increase in spiritual energy versus the decrease in comfort. Okay. All right. So let's jump over to that. Okay. So now we're operating from our Passover point right here. Okay. And from that, we have this premise of a spiritual incline, right? and we have this premise of a physical decline. Okay. And this timeline here is basically kind of the path that we are making to the betrothal, the path that we are making to the betrothal or to Pentecost. Okay. And so we have these three lines going on. Now, remember that this line here is a sine wave going that way. And of course, this line here, using the blue, is, of course, it's going this way. And of course, then our intersection of those two is the actual feast day of Pentecost. All right. So obviously, one of the things that we need to talk about then is this spiritual energy increase versus this physical comfort decrease. Now, normally, what we would say is that the adversity, which would be in the red, the adversity is what? It's discomfort, right, as it were. And the spiritual incline is the result of the response to the discomfort. Now, there is a possibility to just be, in fact, let me go ahead and label this for what it is. This is actually autopilot, which is different for each personality type. But autopilot is just going through the motions because this decline here in the red is going to occur. Okay. So in autopilot, we've got the disassociation from the physical discomfort, or we can have the actual what? Being present. But what we need to do here is we need to talk a little bit about resonance. Okay. Now, this is going to sound really crazy because okay, let me talk to you about this for a minute. Moses and Joshua. In fact, let's actually, you know what? We can just go ahead and turn there. That's what I think I want to do here. Well, so we're just going to go to 16, I believe it is. Yep, it is. Okay. And what we're doing is in Exodus 16, we are looking at this part here, Moses and Aaron, right? But then the premise or the idea here is that Moses and Aaron don't complain. Okay. And we can devise that Joshua and Caleb didn't complain either, but that's a whole nother story. But the premise is that there's people here who don't complain. Did they go through the adversity? Here's my question about that. My question is it an adversity if you don't complain? Now, I know this is going to sound off the wall, but the thought process here is that if you say something, it's because there's something inside of your heart, right? That's what Yeshua says, is that something comes out of your mouth and it's the abundance of your heart. And that is the source of what? Murders, adultery, etc. Right? And so a violation of the commandments is present in the words you speak that are actually the emanation from the heart. Okay. Well, when we talk about the heart, what we're talking about is our innermost being or our center of consciousness. Now, when we discuss that thought process, then we can get into the four human endowments. We can get into sentience, which is kind of the I or self, and what that means to us. We can get into conscience, where we have a sentiment, or not a sentiment, but a of a sense of right and wrong. Okay. And then, of course, we have willpower. And then, of course, we have imagination. Now, the reason why we need to discuss this in this manner is to understand that the process of this whole thing has to do with the idea that no matter what, as the illusion of time progresses on, we will be arriving at the Passover season, and the physical calendar moment of what? The physical calendar moment of the counting of the Omer, and therefore the wilderness season. When I first began to learn these things, it used to drive me crazy because we would go into Passover and everything would be great. But then as the Passover season began, as it started to go into its maturity, it seems like things just got worse and worse and worse. And by the time I got to Pentecost, I was a total attitude, total jerk, going into Pentecost with some sort of chip on my shoulder, getting it over with, and moving into the golden calf season, in which what fatness came, and all of a sudden I'm worshiping false images of myself. By the time I get to the fall feast, I've got this horrible attitude, but I know Yom Kippur is coming, so I have to figure out how to humble myself. And then finally going through Yom Kippur, coming into Sukkot, and my thought process in Sukkot is it's finally over with. Instead of what you should have present in you during the seasons. So now what we have is we have response versus reaction. Okay. So as the adversity starts to come, there's a sense of what? Of reaction, right? The adversity comes and immediately we start searching our frames of reference for the way in which we are supposed to what? React. Whereas a response is something that we consciously choose to do in order to deal with what is present at that moment. Reactivity is usually a knee-jerk, impulsive, reflexive action that happens generally at the subconscious, as at the speed of thought, we search our database for information that would equate to the same thing. And usually that database is a database of wounds or limitations. So when we're dealing with the human being on a psychological level, we are dealing with somebody who cares a whole lot about what others think of them. Furthermore, in that process, we are dealing with a person who what? Deletes, distorts, and generalizes the information that comes in. In addition to all that, we also have one other very important thing, and that is as we drop into our instinctual processes, we abandon the four human endowments. We abandon the self. We abandon our conscience. We abandon our willingness to choose to resonate with the intensification of all power in the universe and be one with the source energy, instead of being a contrary process through that ego-driven animal self. And then, of course, we also abandon imagination. We abandon visualization. We abandon being able to see a future that makes a difference. Okay. All right. So there's a few very important points that we need to get into. But all of this is to say that there is in this whole thing a linear action going on. A linear action. What is that linear action? That's this path right here. That's the linear action. That is time progressing or moving forward, as it were. No matter what, somewhere around March and April, we will celebrate Passover and we will enter the wilderness season. And however extreme or non-extreme this time period is, our response to it is what will be the resulting intensity of this experience. Now, what is important about this has somewhat to do with what we even see going on in the experience of Yeshua's ascendancy. When he ascends, maybe I shouldn't say ascendancy because that kind of sounds like inheritance, but when he ascends. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to put that here. We're going to place that information on our timeline where Yeshua ascends, right? Okay. You can see that it is during a time in which we're getting close to Pentecost, right? We're getting close to Pentecost. Now, the relevance of this is the whole idea that from this point, which was the beginning of a horrible adversity for the disciples, there was what? There was a decline in comfort, right? But eventually there's an incline back to comfort where they've gotten to spend 40 days with Yeshua, right? 40 days with Yeshua before he ascends. And so there's this point where that stops being an adversity and they start to accept that, yes, he has to go. He has to go. Why? He's going to go prepare a place for them. The betrothal is going to occur and he's going to go prepare a place for them. So we can see that no matter how we look at this pattern of events, no matter what way we adjust our thinking concerning this, we find that there's actually this principle or idea that there is going to always be some semblance of discomfort through this action here, okay? And there is going to be some semblance of an increase in spiritual energy here, okay? Okay, so now let's talk a minute about negative versus positive energy. When energy is put out by some greater to a lesser, the lesser chooses how to polarize that energy. I can project positive energy towards you in the process of good vibes, but if you are not in a position to receive those good vibes, right, as it's coming in, you polarize it. So what's interesting is as it leaves me, it neutralizes, right? It is neither good vibe or bad vibe. And as it approaches you, you just feel this energy coming towards you and you decide to polarize it. The idea here is that there's a sending out, right? Remember how Yeshua tells the disciples, go into the city and let your shalom go out. And if your shalom does not return to you, let it return to you. And you dust your feet off, and it will be better for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city, right? But if the shalom does return to you, then you what? If you are received, then you will stay there not a short amount of time. Okay, so in that thought process, then what we have is the vibe going out, but how we choose to receive that vibe and then return it determines whether or not there will be a continuance in that process of healing, knowledge, and fellowship, right? So, what did the disciples bring? They brought knowledge, they brought healing, and they brought fellowship. And so, as now these guys are going out, then we start to see this action occurring. Okay, so everybody would agree with me that there is a height, width, depth, linear governing principle of a progression of the illusion of time. What do I mean by that? Time doesn't actually exist. That is kind of just something that we use to quantize our theory of reality, partially based on the fact that we have the fireball go up in the sky, go down in the sky, and that equates to a 24-hour period. And we have the fireball go up in the sky and go down in the sky for 365-ish days. That equates to our years. And of course, then we define our years by the length of time that we have existed. And of course, Moses says that temporal perception is 75 years, 75 365 days, right? Okay, so in that principle of temporalness, we understand that no matter what, it's gonna come. But in that process, we also understand then that actually becomes a prescribed path. Okay? In other words, there's a flow through time towards the Passover. There's a flow through time towards the wilderness season. That is the prescribed path. That is a predetermined plan. The Hebrew word for a prescribed path is ruach, or what we call the spirit, which is a very unfortunate English word to describe this energy. It is something that is flowing in a certain direction. It is not flowing in this realm, but in the realm of emanation and in the realm of action. In the realm of emanation, obviously, we are dealing with the source and the direction of flow, right? But also in the realm of action, we have a vector. We have a force going in a certain direction and angle. What is that thought process? Well, that principle is that there's a flow, okay? Time is flowing towards the Passover, but that doesn't mean that we are. For example, in 325 AD, the so-called heretics who spoke Christianese decided that the Passover no longer existed, and therefore cut a majority of the believers in the Jewish Messiah off from their flow. Okay. And so from that, we can identify that there is a corporate denial of the flow towards Passover and the flow towards the feast days. That's legit. But there's something more. We, whether we choose to or not, are going to arrive at that moment in time as we understand time. That is a predetermined path that's flowing in that direction. We can choose to go with that flow or not. But in that process, we need to understand in the other realms, that's just an energy, and that energy has a certain vibration to it. And we have a actual attraction to that energy that makes us want and pulls us in that direction, which is what? That's the Torah written on your heart. Okay. Paul says if a Gentile does the things of Torah, he demonstrates that the Torah has been written on his heart and what? His conscience. Oh, there we go. One of the human endowments, meaning he's not an animal at this moment. One of the human endowments, what? Accuses or defends him in what? The day of judgment, which is what? Yom Kippur, which is what? The fall feast. Because why? Because they've gone on this path through the wilderness season into Pentecost, down into the fall feasts, which was the same cycle as the flood. Now, in all of that process, it is important to understand that if the idea of polarization of energy has to do with your intention, then we need to understand that there's a higher and there is a lower frequency. When we are experiencing sadness, anger, all of these negative emotions, there is a lower vibration than if we are experiencing joy and the fruits of the what? Prescribed path, the fruits of the Spirit. Now, here's the interesting part about this is the prescribed path can only be accessed through the proper exiting of the tent. Remember, there's two ways to exit the tent. One is to leave and fall into what? Into shame, into guilt, into nakedness and exposure, which is what? The result of the authority or the epigenetic signature of the rebellion against that flow. Okay. So let's work with a new understanding and a new illustration of the wilderness season in this process. Okay. So there are two very important things that need to be understood about this. Number one, this is issue number one. I just got through telling you that there was an intention that was anti-Semitic and antinomian, which was an action of the church fathers that what? Caused a deviation, a turning away from the path. Okay? And in that process, it is very important to understand that that path is a flow of energy that has a energy signature or a vibration signature that we're familiar with if we are in touch with the higher self, or if we are walking according to what? The Spirit. Okay? Horrible word for the translation of Ruach, which is a prescribed path. Now you're like, well, wait a minute. I thought it was this third person of the Trinity. Yeah, well, you know what? That was probably one of the more anti-Semitic, antinomian doctrines that is present in the religion that speaks Christianese. Okay, so as we work with this, we need to understand something imperative, and that is that there are times in history where there have been constructs created, and this has to do with the four turnings, where we have what? We have the incline of trust. Remember, trust towards established institutions. We have a disillusionment from those institutions and a rebellion against them, and then a incline into individuality. That individuality will then eventually peak and start to turn back into a desire for order instead of chaos, and a return to established institutions. That's the principle of the four turnings, or the winter, spring, summer, and fall of human social and political environments. Now, in that action and process, then we can start to see that there are times where established institutions have to influence the public. And so they will create these constructs of fear, or these constructs of order, or illusions of order that are not actually legitimate processes of order. Why do I bring this up? Because one of the things that even the founder of Reform Christianity brought to the table was the action or process of um, hell and Satan and Lucifer and all of the actions of evil, malevolence, etc. We, of course, have been learning that evil and malevolence and those type of things have their place in what? In the animalistic nature of humanity, in which they stop what? Tapping into the higher self, or the four human endowments, or even a greater and higher self that we have yet to understand. Well, the principle that is really important here is then we need, and it behooves us to ask, what was Abraham's understanding of the devil, right? Of the construct that seems to be the core of Christian motivation, right? And when we talk about spiritual warfare, and we talk about actions of good versus evil, we get into the question of the devil. Well, I think it's important because, remember, the devil is supposedly a deceiver, which means there is an actioning of fluff being wrapped around the absolute truth. Okay, and so when we are working with this, let's go ahead and let's let go of Latin, German, English, and Aramaic. And let's go back to the language that Abraham spoke, and let's go back to the way in which he would have written his words. Okay, because he's the father of all who believe, right? Both circumcised and uncircumcised. All right, so then as we go through that process, now we will what we're going to do is, I think one of the most common and most brought up subjects in Christianity when it comes to the word Satan or devil is Job. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and we are going to go to the book of Job. And while we are in Job, we're going to see some things go on, and there's some mentions of the sons of God and all kinds of other stuff. And there's even a mention of a heavenly court. We're not going to get into all that. We're just going to look at this character in this story. All right, so here we are. One day, the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before Yahweh, and the accuser, Satan, came with them. All right, so now let's look in the Hebrew here. And the accuser, what does it say? It doesn't say Satan. It's not a name. There's a definite article behind it. We never say the Kinatavnu or the Sally or the Deborah. We say Deborah, Kinatavnu, Sally. So now we have all of a sudden this weird anomaly that there's a definite article. Ha, Satan. I'll show you what I mean by that, by the way. See there, that's the definite article. That's the word the in Hebrew. Put a hey in front of something and it's ha Satan. But here's Satan, right? And we jump into that. And of course, in the English, translated Satan. But then when we go into the Strong's Concordance, which of course was concorded to the what? The King James Version of the Bible, which we have plenty of question about. But let's just look at this and say, okay, King James Version of the Bible calls it what? Calls it Satan, but Strong says it's an adversary or one who stands or one who withstands. From the root word, right, which is to act like an adversary, to resist or oppose. Okay. Now, just to give you an idea of the principle behind this word, and not name, but word, verb, Satan, right, is the proper pronunciation of it. We are going to encounter the thought process of, we're going to encounter the thought process of things that you would probably not think had anything to do with the devil. Okay. They, for example, in Psalm 38:20, they repay me evil for good and oppose me for pursuing good. Oppose me. Okay. Now, when we are looking at the actual name, as it is in the English, which is a total dereliction of what? Of translation. It does not say a name. It says the, and then a noun, okay? And it is not a proper noun. Okay, and so from that point of view, we know that it is descriptive from the verb. And remember, nouns are just modified Hebrew words. There's actually no nouns in Hebrew, just modified verbs. Verbs being conjugated a different way. Okay, and so as a result of that, we can have things like, for example, if I am talking about, say, a doctor, okay, that's the Hebrew word Rapha, right? The Hebrew word Rapha means to action healing, not necessarily upon another, but to action healing, period. But Rapha is healing, ing, present tense participle, or putting an ing at the end of the word heal, right? Okay, but what? Rofeh also means doctor in Hebrew. Why? Because it also creates the noun that is what? The healer. Healer. And so very different from our language. We have the word doctor, and then we have the word heal, we have the word doctor, and we have the word treat, right? We do not necessarily have that. We don't call doctors healers. They may heal, but we don't call them healers. Okay, and so the reason why that's important is because now you need to understand that this word, not name, Satan, inappropriately translated in the English, Hasatan in the Hebrew is being identified as a definite article noun. We could define it in the English inappropriately, which you're going to see in a minute, as what? As the opposer, okay? The opposer, or somebody who is in opposition. Okay, so I think what we need to do here is we need to get out of the Strong's Concordance and we need to go back to Abraham's way of doing things for a moment. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to have to discuss something called a cognate, okay? And so I'm going to get on the board here for a minute and explain the cognate to you, explain to you how cognates happen. All right, for example, here's one good way that we could do this. Remember in Judges where there is an issue with the tribe of Benjamin, and they decide that they're going to kill the tribe of Benjamin. And there's a moment in time where they test the tribe of Benjamin to see whether or not it's them because they pronounce a word incorrectly, right? Remember, shibboleth versus sibboleth, right? Shibboleth versus sibboleth. All right. And so that's kind of the principle of this cognate idea. Let's go ahead and get on board for a moment. All right. So here's what we have. We have and I've gone so crazy with my finger here. I think with the finger ink. Let's see. Let's go ahead and let's do this in orange. Okay. So we have the sheen here, right? Oh, that's one of my worst sheens I've done in a while. All right. And then we have the tet, right? And then we have the final nun. Okay. That is the word Satan in the English. Okay. All right. And then what we have is we have the actual ancient pictographic Hebrew where what? We go from the Sheen to the Samek. And so this is actually the proper spelling of that. What happened there? Well, there's this basically that kind of that evolution where the sh sound goes to the s sound. But they maintain this letter, right? Because it's pronounced s or sh. And the way that they distinguish that in the actual vowel pointings is they'll put a dot here if it's sh, and they'll put a dot here if it is s. But in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, that distinction is not present. All s sounds will fall under the samet. Okay, we will leave this up on the board and we will come back to this, but now we need to jump into the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible. Okay, so what we're going to do, I'm just going to copy the Strong's Concordance number here for Satan, right? And we are going to go into the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, not nano. It's going to take a moment for it to load, I think. Lately, I don't know why the Kindle app has not been working well. Let me go ahead and close it for a minute. We'll talk to you while I'm doing this. Basically, the way that you want to think about the process of ancient Hebrew is to think about that most languages, and in fact, there's a really good book out there called The Mystery of the Alphabet, but most languages have descended from a pictographic hieroglyphic type of a language into what we call an ideographic language, and then eventually a phonographic language. So there's a transition from pictures without any pronunciation to them per se, where there's no sounding necessarily relevant, to pictures that are a little bit more like characters and have a sounding and no longer have the pictographic value, to phonographic letters that have no pictographic value, have no semblance of the original picture, and therefore have just the sound, right? As opposed to the image. Okay, so that's what we'll explain about that. And here we are, it finally loaded. Okay, and so I'm just going to go ahead and put into the search our Strong's Concordance number. And of course, I have to remove the H because the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible does not deal in Greek. And the new Strong's numbers have the H and G to them instead of a whole list of numbers that correspond to the whole Bible. They have a distinction between the Greek and the Hebrew. And so here we are with our Hebrew word Satan right there. Okay. But in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, of course, it means opponent. We'll get to that. But here we have what? Samek tet nun, not shin. Okay. And so as a result of that, then what we can do is we can go find out. We know this is an adopted root. Why? Because it doesn't contain a yod, a hey, a vav, an aleph, or a doubled last letter, as you have learned. Sometimes adopted roots are discernible and we can find out without a whole lot of investigation. And in this case, we can. Why? Because we can still see there's a pattern here. And finally, we make it back to our parent root. Let me go ahead and for the sake of teaching, I'm just going to get rid of these highlights. So this is the parent root. There isn't anything further back than this. Our actual Hebrew parent root is a samek het. Okay, so let's go document that on the board really quick, but I'm going to put that in salmon for now. Let's go document that on the board. Okay, actually, you know what? Instead of me being in the picture, we'll do that. All right, and so what I'm going to do is, let's do this in, red. Okay, and so we know that the parent root is actually the samek het. Okay, and so then we can potentially carry that down into Samech Tet, dropping the noon, right? Okay, now in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, we have a very different situation going on. And so now what? We have the concrete, which is what? Opponent. And we'll just do these in blue. We have the action of what? Oppose. And then we have what? We have the abstract of opposition. Why is that abstract that way? Well, we'll get to that. But here we go. The pictograph, okay? The pictograph, Samek, is a picture of a thorn representing a turning. Tet is a picture of a round basket. Combined, these mean turn around. Let me show you what I mean, okay? When we are talking about a thorn in Hebrew idiomatic language. In fact, let me explain that for a moment before I get to my point, and then I will get to my point. When we're talking about an idiomatic language, it's very important for you to understand that an idiomatic language always uses the idioms and never the literals. What do I mean? Well, for example, if I say, let the cat out of the bag, we know that's a secret, right? Well, we can say, oh, this person told a secret, or we can say, oh, they let the cat out of the bag. Sing like a canary, right? It's raining cats and dogs. Hit the ball out of the park. All idioms. But we have the definition of them and use that definition separately. Well, in Hebrew, that's not true. In Hebrew, there's no literal actual statement that says somebody told a secret. Instead, it'll say they let the cat out of the bag. Now, in our brains, we go, oh, let's go find a cat that got out of the bag, right? That's how we think about Hebrew. We try to literalize what the text is actually saying instead of understanding the idiomatic thought process here. So, for example, when Paul says that he was given a thorn in his side, that was a malach of what? Of Satan. We instantly think of some demonic presence or some sort of devil on our shoulder, right? Because we have this wonderful illustration from Milton and from Dante about hell and the devil and all that. So in that principle, then, when we're talking about this, you need to realize that he's actually doing an idiom thing here where he's saying the thorn in his side, which is what, and we're going to discover this in a minute. The thorn in his side is a malach, an angel, or a messenger energy of Satan. No, a messenger energy of Satan is not really what it's saying there. Remember, his letter wasn't written in Hebrew. Or I mean, his letter wasn't written in Greek, it was written in Hebrew. And the process is that it's actually the adjective after the noun. The adjective follows the noun, like in Spanish. For example, if I say red car in Spanish, I will say car red. Well, the same is true in Hebrew. And so the principle is that the adjective follows the noun. And so what? This is what? This is a messenger, or in the Septuagint, angelos, angel of who? Of Satan? No. This is an opposing force, or an oppositional messenger, which we're going to get into later. All right, so now what we have is we have this sentiment, or this process of what? Of the thorn in the side, which of course immediately we lean in the direction of what? Of the crown of thorns. Why? Because that is an image that has been presented in literature, art, and culture throughout the religious history of this separate group of people who spoke and believed and processed Christianese and then became Christian church, which was a deviation from the assembly of believers during Yeshua's time. How do I know that? Because of what happened with Easter. Okay, so the premise and the process is, now what we have going on is this idea of what? Of a thorn being this long, pointy thing. Well, the truth is that there's actually not a whole lot of thorns like that were native to Israel. When we have paleoarchaeologists, paleo herbologists, they will find in the ancient digs the types of thorns and things, and what they encounter instead of these long pointy things is this right here. Okay. Looks a lot like a cocklebur, but what I want you to notice is that it has these little tiny hooks on it. And those little tiny hooks, what they do is they grab hold, right? They grab hold. And so if you are walking down a path and you have one catch your what? Garment. Why? Because their garments went to their feet. The only time you had somebody rocking their legs out in the sunlight is if their loins were girded up, which is where you draw your skirt up. Yes, men, draw your skirt up and then tie it with a belt so you can run. Because why? Because the tightness of the robe, or the skirt, we'll call it, prevents your knees from extending out far enough to run. They spend a majority of their time walking, which explains why the idiom of walk is so relevant instead of run, which is kind of what Paul illustrated of the idea of running a race, right? Okay. So the reason why this is important is because if one of those catches your robe, you stop, turn, and you pick it off to prevent it from what? Being a part of your process. However, if you were to encounter an entire set of bushes of those that had overgrown over the path, then what? You would have to go around it. You would have to deviate from the path, where we get the idea of turning around. let's go back into our ancient pictographic Hebrew. So we know the Samek is a picture of a thorn representing a turning. Now, immediately, we, with our Christianese, think of this long, pointy thing that pierces the skin, but instead it's this thing that grabs hold, okay? Grabs hold. And then what? The tet is a picture of a round basket. Combine this means what? Turn around. You're walking down a path and you turn around and go the other direction, okay? And so the principle is that shepherds could grab these bushes. I mean, look at this thing. Shepherds could grab these bushes off the path and find a clearing and create a what? Hedge of protection. That's what? That's of thorns. No, of these burrs, right? These burrs. I'm going to prove it to you here. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and while I'm talking to you, I'm going to navigate into the ancient Hebrew language and alphabet book because we know that it's possible that it's going to take a minute to load, and actually it didn't. So we are going to go ahead and jump in here real quick. And so I am actually specifically going to go to the Samek. Okay. Now this is on ancient pottery, and here it is. Look familiar? There's your thorn, guys. It's not a pointy, long, spiny thing. It's this little burr-like seed that what? That has hooks on it and that takes hold or grasps. In fact, when we're looking at this, the way that you want to look at this is that in the desert, the Hebrews had many species of thorns and thistles. The picture is of the thorn that attaches itself to the flesh, causing pain. Okay. So when we are working with this thought process, you need to think about a path that is overgrown with these thorns. Okay, that's important because remember, we're dealing with idiomatic processes here that Yahweh chose this language that these people had, right? But these people constructed this language off of their culture, right? They constructed this language off of their culture and their process after the Tower of Babel, very possibly before the Tower of Babel, just depends. Some people believe that Hebrew existed before the Tower of Babel, and therefore that's the only language that made it out in one piece. Either way, however it works out, after the Tower of Babel, we have these pottery shards. Now, the reason why I say that is because when we look at ancient Sumerian and Akkadian, right, even some ancient Canaanite, we encounter these pictographs, but before the Sumerian Empire, we don't encounter these pictographs. Okay, so that puts the Tower of Babel in the Sumerian Empire time period, okay? All right, I'm sure there's probably archaeologists who will say something and say that's not true, but the principle is that that's when they're finding these pottery shards. Like I said, go read The Mystery of the Alphabet. Amazing book, amazing book. Okay. So, in all of this then, we have this thorn, right? That looks like this burr, which consequently, this is a picture where I Googled burrs common to Israel. So this is the actual burr in Israel, and they would construct these hedges of protection with this. Why? Because they hook together, and it's really hard to separate them once they hook together, which is going to become very important in a minute. Okay, so in all of that, then, as we've got this turning around, now we can actually go back into the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, and we can go back to our word. Okay, so now adding the noon back in causes to turn back to another and stand in the way of their path. Okay, let me show you where this is actually the most relevant. In Numbers chapter 22, which is in Torah, we have Balak sending Balaam, right? And we know that Balaam, son of Beor, is approached by these elders of Moab. They finally convince him to come, and finally he decides to go with them. And then in the morning, as he leaves, it says in verse 22, so this is Numbers 22:22, very easy to remember, 22:22. But God was angry that Balaam was going, so he sent the angel of the Lord to stand in the road to block his way. Wrong answer. What does it say? It says to stand in the road, right? To stand in the road as what? Satan. The angel of the Lord stands as Satan in the road, right? Stands as Satan in the road. And actually, if you really, really technically want to get crazy, watch this. The ancient the usage of the word lamed, or I'm sorry, the letter lamed in sentences is translated to or for in the English, but it's actually in the ancient grammar for the sake of. And so this literally says what? It says malach, angel of what? Yahweh. This is in the construct form, which means it's angel of Yahweh. What? In the direct, in the path, right? For the sake of Satan. Oh boy, I do not know if that's something that we necessarily want to get into today. However, in this process, remember, we were trying to get back to this, Okay, so now you see now that this is another idiomatic process of something blocking the path and causing you to deviate off the path. That path is what? Prescribed, right? So whether you have a path that you choose to walk down on your own or you have a prescribed path, let's talk about that for a minute. So there's actually some instruction that is given to the Magi when they come to Jerusalem, where the angel comes to the Magi and says, "Do not return to your country the way that you came." Why? Because they used the highway. They need to use a different path. So they went from choosing what path they wanted to go on to the angel saying, go use a different path or use this path to go down. So there's an element here of, of instruction, right? So a prescribed path is basically a path that has some sort of intention from a greater giving information to a lesser with an expectation. That would be instruction. Information being given to a lesser from a greater with expectation, right? Okay. So we have this proscribed path. What's that proscribed path? We're moving towards Passover. Now, as we're moving towards Passover, we have an entire deviation from it to Easter, which is a whole nother subject and discussion, but we're just going to leave all them over there. Why? Because those of you who actually are on this prescribed path is who I need to talk to now. So in the process of everything that we've experienced thus far, remember, we've kind of come to the conclusion that evil is a weak mind. We've come to the conclusion that light is a strong mind. And so we have evil being equated with darkness, and we have light or good being equated with we have good being equated with light, right? God saw that the light was good, not evil. Okay, and so the strong mind is good, not evil. All right. So there's a few reasons why that's important, but the biggest reason that we really need to touch upon is this idea of being an opposer. Now, when we get back to our thought process of energy, this will really start to come into play. So there is this idea that when there is one energy present and another energy present and they're vibrating at different frequencies, there's a moment when those vibrations will start to what? They will start to vibrate together. Okay? Now, that doesn't say anything about polarization. All that says is that when two energies are present, there is a law in physics that says that eventually they will sync up. Now, we could get into cycles of nature where this is true. We can get into social situations where this is true. We can get into spiritual energies where this is true. So here's how I want you to think about it. You've walked into a room before and been like, oh, bad vibe, bye, and left, right? Like immediately knew that you just didn't want to be there because of what? Because of, let me go over here for a moment, because of discomfort. Discomfort. Okay. So when we are talking about this, the way I want you to think about this is this idea that energy is not polarized except by intention. Okay? Energy comes to you. You can either receive it and return it with the same polarization that it was offered to you, or you can convert it and change it into something different. And then you can either project it out or you can walk away and have it. That's the idea of stealing energy and not sharing it. Scarcity mentality versus abundance mentality, which we talked about last week. Now, here's how this becomes important. What actually causes a person to deviate from a path is distrust. Let me explain. When we are working with trust, there is a almost blind willingness to what? To eventually sync up. Okay? And as that resonant energy is now what? In connection with it, in harmony, as it were, and that they're getting along and there isn't dissonance. Okay? There's an actual flowing and correct process of energy, and those vibrations are connected with each other in a harmonious or in a unison way. Okay, if we were to use the theory of music, you're either in unison or you're in harmony. The premise is that the vibrations will agree with each other, and the vibrations will then what? They will create an intensity. That's where we get the damage from the bridge in Washington, where the wind was vibrating with the bridge so much so that the bridge started doing this number and eventually just ripped itself apart. Same thing for the bridge that was in England, where people didn't realize it, but there was a moment in time where the first person stepped out on the bridge and his gait set the pace and the step in such a way that the pace and the step caused the rest of the group to sync up and pace and step. And there was actual structural damage being done to a perfectly engineered bridge because there was one thing not taken into consideration, and that was resonance. resonance intensifies the situation. So when two frequencies or two vibrations sync up, and I may be misspeaking that, but when there's two energies sync up in their vibration process, there is an intensifying of it. Okay. But here's the part that's crazy. Like kind attracts like kind. So there's these other energies that come in and they agree with the rest. That's what happened with that bridge. Everybody walked at the same pace and step as the first man who stepped out onto the bridge. And by the time there was over, like, I think there was I think it was in the thousands of people that had walked on this bridge with that same frequency, they had actually damaged the bridge and they had to close it down. The concept here and the idea is that if there's a dissonance present, then there's an instantaneous aversion to proceeding any further with that. For example, when we experience cognitive dissonance, that's an uncomfortable energy that says there's something wrong with our frame of reference versus what we perceive. And so we say, this doesn't match this, something's wrong. And it's a discomfort, which we as human beings like to move away from, not towards. So when we are moving through discomfort, there's an obvious experience of what? Negativity, as it were, or adversity. That adversity is then what? Going to create within us what Yahweh said about the hunger, or what he said about the process of hunger, which was that we would what? We would curse God and say, God brought us out into the wilderness to die. Really, technically, we're cursing ourselves. But the premise is, because remember, he says, okay, you wanted to die in the wilderness, now you're gonna. That's exactly what he said. And he said, I was angry with that generation. From that day, I was angry with that generation and swore they would not enter my rest, and they died in the wilderness. Literally, the waters of Meribah, or the wilderness season, is when Israel lost their admission ticket. Now, what happened? The energy of fear and the energy that they had attracted in the wilderness of Meribah carried over to the moment when they were in Kadesh Barnea and they were about to enter the promised land, and they said, no, we can't go. We'll be like grasshoppers in their eyes, and our children will become what? Prey. Our children will become prey to them. Okay, so you can see now where there's proof of this energy becoming resonant, and then what? Becoming a bad vibe and a bad influence and a bad thing, but intensifying to the negative. Okay. And then we have energies where we walk into a situation and we're like, wow, this place is amazing. And these people are amazing. And everything's wonderful because everybody is what? Resonating at a positive energy and a positive process. And even people who are vibrating at a wrong frequency, when they come into and see that greater influence and intensity of energy, will sync up and be brought into that influence of more positive process. So now what we have is, when we think about this, we think about where Yeshua says, bless and don't curse, right? Where he says, pray for those and bless those, right? He wasn't wanting you to be a rug. And we can see plenty of places where Yahweh gave a commandment to the nation of Israel to commence to whooping on their enemies, right? Remember, he tells Saul, go kill Amalek, who attacked my people in the wilderness season. That's now in the parasha. That's during the counting of Omer in the physical height with depth time realm, okay? But in the parasha, in the discussion about this, we are experiencing Amalek. Now, here's something interesting. As Moses raises his hands, he's what? He's for or on behalf of Israel. But when he lowers his hands and runs out of the energy to hold them up, Amalek, the opposer to Israel, or the Satan to Israel, prevails, right? And so they have to go hold his hands up for him. That's that same principle of the polarization of energy. That's that same principle of what? Of the opposition having more influence than the side that is not the opposition. So when we think about the Hasatan and we think about this prescribed path, which is actually an energy moving in a specific direction in a very different realm than height, width, depth, time, we experience this difference in resonance or difference in vibration, and we sync up with that and go down that flow, right? Going down the flow, or what? Walking according to the spirit and not according to the what? The ego, the flesh, the animal who is only concerned with self-preservation, connectivity, which would be validation, and reproduction. So in this now we can see where the Satan is a dissonant energy. Okay, the dissonant energy. And now what we can find is in this dissonant energy, there is an intention to cause a turning away. And so Satan, Hasatan, is actually the illustration of what? Well, what do we have here? Let's start to document this a little bit. So we have the Hasatan being what? The thorn, right? And the turning of the basket or of the container, so the roundness of it. And then we have the noon coming down and becoming a continuance. A continuance, which would be what? A resonant energy would be what? An idea that it has the ability to stay or be present instead of it being intercepted or interrupted. Remember that the Israelites had to leave their bondage. They had to leave the Mitzrayim or the limitations, but they were not allowed to go learn war yet unless they might be tempted to return to their limitations. There was a maturity that had to occur after the attack of Amalek, right? So Amalek attacks Israel. Moses decides the energy, right? He decides whether they prevail or not, which I proposed to you was a prescribed adversity to show that they could prevail or they might not prevail, and that it was based upon the intention of a prophet who's an example to the rest of people how to be spiritual with their actions. Now, all of this is important because of this, right? Because why? Because when we first leave the limitations, we leave the limiting beliefs, we have a bunch of fluff that we need to strip away in order to get back to the absolute source, or what we would call truth, which the principle or law of truth says that we will instantaneously trust. Okay. Now, there is a reason why this is important. That is because now we understand that this opposition is not some malevolent force that is present external from the process of energies being polarized by human beings. Now, I know that that just stepped on some toes because you guys still have the guy in the red pajamas with the pointy tail and the pitchfork running around, standing on your shoulder and being being an influence that's trying to convince you to go to a place where supposedly intensification of all power in the universe creates a temporal realm where you get about 75 cycles of the sun over a 365-day year. You get 75 of those to get it right. And if you don't, you go to an eternal damnation or punishment where he is the ruler, but just so also happens to have the omnipotence to also influence every human being at once. And then and again, and all of that also has the ability to have the same or equal power of God. No, that's just one of the turnings. That's just one of the archetypes of social process where we create a construct to control the masses. So what's the reality of Satan? What's the reality of Hasatan? It is a polarization of energy through intention. And that polarization of energy through intention is based upon whether you are in an animal state or whether you are in a higher self. Now, before you get all bent out of shape, let me see if I can show you some things where this is true. Okay. So take, for example, Ahab. Ahab is married to this wicked queen, right? This horrible human being. If we ever had somebody who was content to stay in her wounds and content to stay damaged and content to stay stuck in her limitations and yet dabble in the power of what we're talking about right now, it would be Jezebel. Jezebel believed that there was a certain way in which you could manipulate all that and still stay in your darkness. And so as a result of that, Ahab becomes her husband, and Ahab now is an offense to God or an opposer of God or a Satan. And therefore now Yahweh says, who will convince Ahab to go in the battle that I might kill him? Now, here's something interesting about that. Why not just strike him down? I'm going to illustrate for you in a minute. Why not just strike him down? So the principle is now there is this concept or this idea that comes along, and in its simplicity, the way it works is there is a spirit that says, I will go down and I will be in the mouth of the prophets as a liar, as a lying tongue, in the mouth of the prophets. Remember our discussion about the anointed, about the prophet. I will be in the mouth of the prophets. It doesn't say false prophets, but I will be in the mouth of the prophets and a lying tongue convincing him to go into battle. But what? There's always a mercy. Remember, his first emanation is mercy, chesed, right? At the first perceivable part of our perceivable God is mercy, not judgment. As a result of that, the way that we need to think about this is that that's his default. Every information that passes through to the intensification of all power in the universe that makes a decision about all the different emanations that are going out from him and how he's going to intensify, decrease, etc., he is going to, or I should say, it is going to become perceivable first. But all the information going up through that perceivable God is what? Passing through the filter of mercy. Remember, mercy only is present if you are guilty. The only way you can be guilty is if you have done something wrong or perceived that you've done something wrong, because sometimes it's not wrong, but you think it is. Okay, so in that process now, what we have is we have this element of there always being a mercy. So here comes this prophet And when he speaks, he says, I saw in heaven a discussion about how to convince Ahab to go into battle that I might kill him. We're going to get to that in a minute. And in that process, then we understand that we also are going to work with what? The mercy. And he says, don't go into battle, Ahab. And Ahab says, this dude always talks crap about me. Lock him up until I get back and only feed him bread of affliction, which is matzah, and water. So, yeah, that little cracker you guys eat on Sunday mornings, every second Sunday of the month or whatever, it's the bread of affliction. You're only supposed to eat it once a year, and that's at Passover. And it was actually a result of the fact that what was eventually going to happen at Passover was the mourning, the dead, the breaking of the body of Yeshua. Okay, that's a side note. So at any rate, now Ahab goes in the battle, dies, and of course the liberating king comes along and lets Micah back out. But Michal back out. But the principle is that this spirit was a lying spirit in the mouths of prophets, which gets us to a very interesting moment with this. That this fluff wrapped around truth is actually part of the plan. Are we supposed to strip it? Yes, we are. But in that process, we need to think about what's actually happening here. Yahweh doesn't go and strike him with a disease or something like that. Now, there are three things that he brings against the city: famine, pestilence, and sword. So those are the three possible ways in which you could die in judgment. Okay. So as we're working with this thought process, now we can see that he chose this very specific thing, which was what? Another nation prevailing against Israel. Why? Because remember Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel was where Elijah had to show Israel that Yahweh was God and not Baal or Ashtoreth, and had to put to death the prophets of Baal and Ashtoreth. Okay? Now, the point being is that Israel was out of order. They were already in a very inappropriate process of not walking according to the teaching and instruction of God. If you do a study, you'll figure out that those correspond to certain Christian holidays that have replaced the Hebrew holidays. Now, in all of that, there is now this principle that Abba Yahweh will raise up a military group. Remember this thing going on? Well, now all of a sudden there's what? This. And what is their intention? Their intention is to do something to the nation of Israel. Now, we remember that it said what in Judges chapter 3, that these are the nations which God left in the land so that the Israelites would learn war: Philistines, Amorites, etc. Okay, I'm not going to go through that list right now. Originally, it says that he would drive those nations out. Originally, he does not put them in a position where they would have to do that. But something changed, and that thing that changed basically made it to where he now had to make a reality. Because why? They were in the land of Canaan. They were sovereign. He honored the ownership of Abraham even to that generation. Recall, I have shown you in the past, in Midrash, probably not in the actual teaching, where God asks Abraham permission to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because Abraham owned Sodom and Gomorrah. So now they're in the promised land and they're supposed to drive out these guys because they need to what? Learn war. Okay. But instead, what happens is an infestation occurs. And you guys remember the cycle of Israel. An infestation occurs in which they say, hey, come after our gods. They go and they start serving the other gods. And eventually they become oppressive and then possessive of them. They go from making rules and kind of being more of a greater than a lesser to Israel to actually taking over and taking things away. For example, the Philistines during during Saul's time would not let the Israelites have blacksmiths, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So when I'm not Saul's time, Samuel's time. So when we are working with this, now what we see is that Yahweh will raise a nation up to oppress the Israelites. They will cry out, and the Israelites will then have a judge come, muster the army of Israel, and they will deliver themselves, which means what? They could have delivered themselves to begin with. But their identity changed, their thought process changed. They returned to what? Limiting beliefs, Mitzrayim, Egypt, where he didn't want them to return if they experienced war, which is the principle of what? Of leaving the fluff on the truth in order to effectively cause there to be a very different process as there begins to be this releasing of limiting beliefs, this healing of wounds, and this acceptance of identity. Okay, so as we're working through this, when information comes in and when energy comes in, we polarize it according to our attitudes and actions and words. And those attitudes, actions, and words then what? Change the energy into either something negative or something positive. If we're talking about a prescribed path, or we're talking about coming into alignment, remember it says the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit, oneness of those two vibrations, right? We come into alignment with that, then now we're moving down this prescribed path with proper intention, and we actually join the intensity of that prescribed path because of resonance. And so now all of a sudden we become the influence, not necessarily the majority, but the influence of intensity as a corporate collective consciousness, or the bride. And as we move towards Passover, then we begin to what? Adorn ourselves with desirability, drawing the gaze of Yahweh. Remember, there was a need to breach the hardness of his heart, because only a hardness of heart causes divorce, and there needed to be a breaking and a softening of his heart so there needed to be a breach through the hardness of his heart and draw his gaze as the beautiful adorned bride, and he would allow Israel to return to the kingdom of heaven, which is what? Within you, which is basically the principle that if you are in a state of he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God, which is that idea of meritless entitlement. In other words, he titles you with righteousness. He says, you are the righteousness of God. It is not by your doing. But then it says that she's adorned with what? The dikomi, right? In the Greek, the dikomi, the righteous acts of the saints. But that is the word that's actually used in Romans chapter 8, verse 4, which is the righteous requirements of the law will be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Now, here's the kicker. That word fulfill is a horrible translation of the word pleru, which is a play off of the Septuagint word pleru that was used to replace the word melo, which means to intensify. I have not come to destroy the law, but to intensify it, right? To intensify it. And in fact, we see that. He goes from saying, even if you don't do the action and you think it, you've already committed it in your heart, which means what? That is what you will draw to yourself, and that's what you will eventually become. Okay, so in all of that, we see him raise the bar, as it were, or intensify the law. Okay, now, that means that the righteous requirements of the law would what? Would be intensified in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Which means what? Obedience would be intensified, in which then we could serve in the spirit of Torah instead of the letter of Torah, which is the Torah written upon our hearts, which is a resonation with the prescribed path. The key here is the response to the adversity during the wilderness season plays a role. Remember, bless and don't curse. Why is he saying that? He's saying raise the energy, right? Polarize the energy to the positive and resonate in it, because you will intensify it and influence and draw then in more, or idiomatically heap coals of indignation on their heads. Okay, and so in that process, then now we understand that the Hasatan is the opposing energy or the opposition to the prescribed path. Okay, if that's the case, then we can safely say that our ego and the animal nature, as it were, I shouldn't say nature because that tempts you to think about original sin. You do not have within you a prescribed intention to do evil. You have within you the power to polarize. There's a big difference there. But there is built into you an instinct to preserve. Of course there is. Think about this. If all of a sudden you are on a construction site and something comes swinging towards you and you duck, that was self-preservation. That's not a bad thing. But if you were to duck and your friend's head was right here and they didn't duck, then one could argue that was a little bit on the side of selfish. You might want to grab your friend and throw you both out of the way. You see what I mean? So there can be inappropriate self-preservation. We see that in cows when they stampede. All right, so the reason why that's relevant is because now we understand that there is a reason for the negative resonance, in that sometimes Yahweh is going to use those to remove an influencer that is a real problem. This is where we get the confounding of the languages. This is where we get the flood. This is where we get these moments when there is a need for him to interfere with the general flow of what's going on. Now, the reason why this is so relevant is because as we come into the Passover season and move into the wilderness season, and that adversity begins to come into play, where we are allowed to be hungry and not fed, and we are allowed to be thirsty and not quenched, and we are allowed to be attacked by our enemy, and there has to be a polarization of energy in order to overcome it. Because why? The manna's coming, the water's coming, the vengeance of God is coming. He's going to avenge the Amalekites eventually. We see that with Saul. Now, why that is so relevant and important is because now we can look back at this picture. We can look back at this thorn, and we can understand a little better what is going on with it. If that is in the path, then we are going to deviate from the path, which means what? We are going to begin to vibrate at a different frequency, or however you want to call it. We are not going to be in with the flow of energy that's moving in a certain direction. That is the idiomatic, mystical process of the thorn, okay? Now, the premise is that the ego, which is a self-preservation, connection, validation slash reproductive instinct in us, can inappropriately interfere through what? Through an inappropriate use of imagination that basically, here's the interesting thing about it. If you inappropriately use your sentience, if you inappropriately use your conscience, if you inappropriately use your willpower, if you inappropriately use your imagination, they will cease to operate. So here we have fear. Fear is an imagination about the future, about things that may or may not come to pass, right? And what do? We emotionally attach to those thoughts, or what we would call visualizations. Some people may feel those as unctions, or some people may hear those as auditory or some sort of influence of audible discussion. Some people may experience that as some sort of visualization. But the point is that the imagination has now created a construct, not reality, an augmented reality, right? That doesn't exist. The future does not exist, just so you guys know. That is another illusion. There's no such thing as the future. There's just now. I dare you to somehow be in the future right now at this moment. You can't. You can visualize it. You can have visions about it. You can have dreams about it. You can hear about it. There can be some sort of audible discussion in the Na'um between you and Yahweh about the future. That's prophets, right? Or you can feel a magnetic pull in a certain direction about the future. But the truth is it doesn't exist, right? It doesn't exist until it exists. So the principle is that we have this imagination about the future, and when we use our imagination about the future with a fear, watch this, this is very, very important. We will imagine that, have an emotional attachment to it, create a behavior that is a compensation of reaction to it, and we will stop imagining. What do I mean by that? You will stop using that tool to deal with the problem. You'll stop imagining. You boom, fear, done. Okay, I've compensated for it. Now I carry this, or now I think this way, or now I do this thing. And I no longer imagine or think about how to create a solution. You see that? The same is true of willpower. You choose the wrong path, and this path right here no longer contacts you and says, hey, excuse me, but you should resonate with me. That's why people go, well, I go and I celebrate Easter and I don't feel any conviction from the Spirit. I go and I eat a pork sandwich because I don't feel any conviction from the Spirit. Well, you know what? Your Bible already told you not to do it. So in principle, you've already been given the instruction. You don't need the Spirit to tell you not to do it. Conscience. Let's say that we're in the middle of a conscience conflict and we do not listen to our conscience. And what is the conscience? Our conscience is awakened when we do something that initiates the emotion of guilt. The conscience is awakened and we realize we've done something wrong. A wrong response to guilt will result in what? In falling into depravity, or falling into a state of what? Living in our wounds, living in our limiting beliefs, and not believing our identity. Okay, so you violate your conscience. You actually choose not to respond to guilt correctly, the painful emotion that lets you know you've done something wrong, and you don't cry out for mercy, which is the only way mercy is activated in the first place, is if you do something wrong. Remember, where sin abounds, grace abounds much more. That word is chesed, which means mercy. Okay, so in that process, then what we have is we have now a use of the conscience in an appropriate manner. So what happens? You stop having a conscience. It no longer is hard to sin. It no longer is difficult to be mean to somebody. It's no longer difficult to consume substances and overindulge in them, because you've seared your conscience. Your conscience stopped asserting itself. And of course, then we have sentience, where what? We assert the ego, the I, the importance of self. And what happens? It dies. There's no more sentience. You go straight into an animal process and you do things that you never believed you would ever do. Because why? Because you no longer have a conscience, you no longer have imagination, no longer have willpower, and you no longer actually have a sense of self, but instead a completely disassociated reality. That's autopilot as you go through the wilderness season. So now what we need to do is we need to talk a little bit about, for lack of better words, calculus. The principle behind calculus works like this. Think of the idea that if you have, in fact, let me just put this on the board really quick. And the reason why we need to talk about calculus is because it is the key to the depth of this wisdom. Okay. So here's the principle of calculus. We have let's say a triangle. Okay. And now the principle is if I draw a line like this, now there are what? There are two triangles. If I was to draw a line like this and like this, now there's more triangles. Oh, wait, there's some more, right? Oh, wait, there's some more. Oh, wait, there's some more, right? Here, oh, there's some more. Do you see what I'm doing here? It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller until it's actually approaching infinity. Okay. There's an infinitesimal, we call it, amount of smallness. That's the principle of calculus, is how calculus works. We figure out the infinitesimal or smallness or greatness of something. But the reason why I bring calculus up is because that means that there's a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller version of this, and there's a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger version of this. Meaning what? As I've said before, there are cycles, right? There are cycles. So we have this cycle of Passover in the height, width, depth, time, sun going up and coming down world. We have a day in which we celebrate and eat the Passover meal. We have a parasha falling 1 to 2 to 3 months before the Passover, telling us about the Passover story. But then what we have is we have the sun, moon, and stars, or the fourth day of creation, emanating a very specific wisdom that's to be for days, for seasons, that's the Moedim in the Hebrew, for signs, well, we're not ready for that word yet, for signs and for years, which means what? There is a Passover that happens during the day. There is a Passover that happens during the month. There's a Passover that happens during a decade. There's a Passover that happens during a Shemitah. There's a Passover that happens during a Jubilee. Down to the very second, there's actually a Passover, a wilderness season, a betrothal, a Pentecost, a tabernacles. It's energy happening in a different realm, and it's happening as a result of that. This is the pattern by which there is a process or wisdom being emanated from the intensification of all power in the universe. So why is that important? Because now we understand why he would take this, wrap this around it, and use this, which we would technically call deception, right, or manipulation, to create an adversity against those who were on the prescribed path, in order to what? To show them blind spots, to show them the things that when they approached Passover, they got all dolled up and pretty and danced and made themselves completely desirable, breaching the hardened heart. So now she is desirable, so he will choose her. And then what? she masked all of the defects. She didn't show all of the attitudes, words, and actions that are hidden in her heart. And out of the abundance of the heart, they would eventually come. Why? Because she wants to be chosen. So we walk into the Passover season, which is from what? That moment when we drink the cup, right? Into Pentecost with the sentiment from Passover of hiding those defects. So as we enter into the wilderness season, nobody gets to actually know that we are actually resentful of God, angry with God about the adversity, which is the cycle of Passover, not the actual day of Passover. Do you understand the difference? When we're talking about something infinitesimally smaller, we're down to the very second that there's actually a Passover. Okay? Every second there's a Passover. Okay, and so the whole idea here is that there is a time of masking, a time of adversity that exposes that masking of those defects of character, but also an accentuation of beauty. Remember the accentuation of beauty, which is what? That's the shadchan, which is what? The thing that draws us into resonance with the true emanation of God, which reduces the fluff from this to this, right? We now arrive at this thought process of there being a oneness with the emanation of the intensification of all power in the universe, or the next closest connection to it, right? And so as there is this two energies separate from each other, this is the Ruach, the prescribed path energy, and this is our own energy. And now all of a sudden they line up and start going together. And as they start going together, then what? There's an actuation of her beauty, which is the Shadchan. It's the matchmaker bringing the two energies together and saying, you're just as beautiful. You just need to start vibrating at my frequency. And as you start to vibrate at my frequency, then you will intensify me. Okay? So as our behaviors, our thoughts, our actions, our attitudes, what's an attitude? It's the belief of how we can treat somebody or something. Okay, so our attitudes, our thoughts, our behaviors, and our words all reflecting this new vibration. Now, what's interesting is as that vibration intensifies, now here comes another vibrating energy way out here, but it starts to what? It starts to be drawn towards this direction because why? It's already some sort of harmony with it. That's where we get people going, man, I don't know if Sunday's really the Sabbath. And they start to ask questions, and next thing you know, they start to vibrate with the same energy. Now, the reason why I said this isn't about those who have already taken that path over there is because a Christmas and Easter Christian, or somebody who's dedicated to the Christianese of that religion, as it were, and not of the spirituality of our Messiah, Jesus Christ, you can find within those traditions and within those cultures an anti-Semitic, antinomian, or anti-Torah sentiment, which completely what creates dissonance with that energy. But now what we have, interestingly enough, is a prescribed path with a thorn bush overgrown over it. And as we encounter that, we want to turn away, right? We want to turn away. And so it's interesting, Yahweh will use the thorn bushes, the hedges of protection, the nations to protect his people just as much as he will use them to what? To realign his people back to where they're supposed to go. What does that mean? That means that the adversity isn't always against us, but sometimes is on behalf of us. For example, there has been times where Israel has had assistance from other nations in order to overcome. Even Abraham had a covenant with Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, to the extent that when he took all of the entire land of Canaan in the fight with Chedorlaomer, and so the king of Sodom and Gomorrah comes along and says, hey, you can have the spoils. I just want the people. And Abraham said, I don't want nothing from you, but give it to Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. They are my friends. So what does this all equate to? Number one, we don't have to depend on the actual calendar moment of Passover in order to be in the wilderness season or the Passover season or the betrothal or the consummation of marriage. Just like we don't have to be in the actual calendar days of the year in order for creation to occur. It did not have to be 7 actual days, because we do not understand what's actually going on in Genesis. And as we continue to put out the videos for Genesis in the image of God, you will start to understand more about that. But the point is that there are various aspects of your life that are in Passover right now, various aspects of your life that are in this over here. Proper response to adversity results in an accentuation of the spiritual beauty of the bride. Because as more of us resonate at that frequency and fall into that flow of energy, the more intense it becomes and the more influential it becomes, because separate energies, when they get together, will line up with each other. But if this energy is greater, it will potentially realign this energy. But what if you became the adversary? What if you were the one who dropped into your ego and used words, and now you have caused energy to vibrate differently? One could argue that then you are an enemy of God. Well, this is what it says. The flesh is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can it be, because the flesh is an enemy of God, right? But also there is a spot in that wonderful work that Paul did of Romans, where he says, while we were yet sinners, right? While we were violating Torah, Christ died for us. But then what does he say? He says, we were enemies of God, but now we've been brought near. And of course, in Ephesians, it says we've been brought near to the covenant, which is what? A marriage covenant between Israel and Yahweh that had to occur after the death of Yeshua, or a renewing of the covenant, as it were. Now, here's the principle behind all of this. You, whether you choose to believe it or not, are that adversity when you choose not to respond correctly to adversity. So what's interesting about that is as you start to what? Create and polarize a negative energy, you attract those other energies to you that resonate at that same harmony. What does that mean? That means that just as you can intensify to the positive, you can intensify to the negative. And if that's true, then you can actually become that nation who is going to destroy Israel. It doesn't really matter whether they are being disobedient or not. What matters is that you are now going to become a tool of adversity, which means what? You are going to injure others. Now, here's the part that's relevant. Words, actions, whatever, are information coming into the psyche, which is generalized, distorted, and deleted. But it is a memory, so to speak. What does that mean? That means that there will not be a forgetting of what you said, did, or thought about the person. Those energies are persistent. That's the noon in the Samach Tet noon. We go from Sat, which is just turning around, to Satan, which is the continual turning around, or the turning around continues. Meaning what? It sticks with us. Injuries, wounds, etc., stick with us. But remember from my discussion last week, or from our Renewing Our Mind series is where I really discuss it, where I flat out say, look, you create the construct of the wound. They do the damage, but you create the construct of the wound and then you live in it. You augment reality. So now the next time that's triggered by somebody, you augment that reality. They're not the ones that hurt you, but they have something that triggers something like you. Now, here's the horrible thing. Millennials and Generation Z have adapted this word, oh, you're triggering me. Well, they're kind of right, except that, again, this kind of turns into entitlement that now you have a right not to be triggered. No, you have a right to heal so that you don't trigger anymore. You don't have a right to not be triggered. People have a right to speech. People have a right to how they do actions as long as it doesn't encroach upon your physical health or upon your mental health. And please don't take that to the point where you believe that somebody saying something about you is going to somehow alter your mental health. It takes a little bit more than that because of our resilience as humans. So what is the point here? What is all of this? What is this thing behind me? What is this chaos behind me? What is this mess behind me? It is you in your wounds, in your limitations, and with your lack of imagination. It is you self-preserving, connecting for external validation, believing the wrong voices, believing the wrong information and the wrong visualizations about who and what you are, right? And also, it is you creating that energy and attracting more of those energies to you that now becomes what? A corporate collective Satan. So what is and who is Satan? It is the group of people who oppose the prescribed path. And it is the group of people who have chosen to live in their wounds, stay in their limitations, or try to return to their limitations, who would rather speak and say that the same God that delivered them from what? From the Egyptians, that delivered them from the limitations, now has brought them out into the wilderness to die, right? And then in that process, understanding that then they have to what? They have to go through an adversity of war in order to understand that they could actually prevail, that they could actually do something more, something better. I always tell people the reason why the serpent was put in the garden is so that Adam wouldn't eat the fruit. And until he doesn't, we will repeat this same thing over and over and over again. We are stuck in a loop, and that is the true definition of death or Sheol, is that you not ascend. You not ascend to a higher energy. You not ascend to a greater resonance of a higher energy. There may be those of you who feel like you need to create the construct of an enemy because it's just not okay for adversity to exist. I don't know how many people say, oh man, the devil got at me today. The devil didn't get at you. Your wounds, your limitations, and your lack of imagination got at you, and you lashed out. Devil didn't get at you. The adversity came and you reacted instead of responding. You didn't create a gap between stimulus and response. You acted impulsively, and it's your fault and it's on you. There is no actual legitimate opposing equal opposite force of God. And furthermore, in the process and the context of these energies, you need to understand that we were made a little lower than Elohim. We are sons of Elohim, or we are Elohim, and therefore we are way above any of that created mess down there that's opposing God. Okay? And so from that perspective, then you need to understand that just like Israel was convinced that they could actually beat Amalek, or just like Israel was convinced that they could deliver themselves from the Midianites after Gideon led them in the battle, which they could have done in the beginning anyways, but they didn't believe their identity. Remember, lack of imagination and wounds and limiting beliefs alter your identity, alter what you think others think about you. Remember, no matter what, you're stuck in that. You will always, 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 always care about what other people think. Don't tell me you won't, because you will. As a result of that, then we need to try to find somebody who's worthy enough to say something about us that is actual truth, right? As opposed to not truth or a lie. All a lie is is absolute truth wrapped in fluff. That's it. Okay. And so, do you want to be a prophet with a lying tongue? Or do you want to be the prophet who says, or who's the vessel of mercy? Ahab, don't go into battle. You're going to die. Right? Or do you want to be the hedge of thorns preventing somebody from walking down the path that is the prescribed path, the Ruach, right? Or do you want to be the one who takes that same instrument, plucks it off of the path, takes the sheep over into a field, creates a hedge of protection with that same instrument of opposition, now preventing what? Nations from coming in and creating a very different energy with the sheep, right? You see how Yahweh chose a culture and a people and a language that effectively illustrates the level of process in his energies and in our energies, since we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and have to operate under the spiritual laws that everybody refuses to believe exist, because we're too busy trying to convince ourselves that somehow, some way, we lost our tail. When the truth is that all we really need to think about is how high of a vibration we have stepped into, because there's a moment in time, guys, where we start to get into the idea that, number one, this energy is resonant beyond death, but also that this energy persists regardless of the composition of matter, which is how you could walk on water, which is how you could reverse death, which is how you could heal a limb that doesn't exist, which is how you can tell a man who was born lame or blind to see or walk. It's beyond the height, width, depth, time realm that is governed by the physical laws, right? But what's interesting is those physical laws are actually subject to the other realms. This is the lowest realm, and therefore is the lesser, which means there's a greater realm, which is the authority and influence of that other realm. Malchut Hashamayim is not the same as Malchut Haaretz. Malchut Haaretz is the lowest Malchut, the lowest kingdom. But Malchut Hashamayim is within you, right? That's the kingdom of heaven is within you. Yeshua said that. And therefore, what you need to get your mind wrapped around is do you want to do and be and accept what he says and believes and had tried to convince you of and teach you how to practice? Or do you want to continue to do what's right in your own eyes? And I would propose to you that where you need to start is by taking that page that is in between Malachi chapter 4 and Matthew chapter 1 and ripping it out. Because there's no such thing as an old and new. Okay? Never did Yahweh propose that the law, the prophets, and the writings would become old and dead and die. Tanakh is not the Old Testament. The Torah, the Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings, is the entire set presented to us. And the latter writings, which are known as the God spells or the go spells, the good spells, either way, it's the word spell in there, right? And the writings of the Rabbi Shaul, right, all are a compendium of information that is self-contained and resonates with itself. And when you create that limitation, when you create that page in between, you already don't have any business on this path here. You're already over here. And I didn't even speak to them over here today. Because why? Because they still have to learn something very different and very new. But for those of you who are actually walking down the prescribed path with an expectation that you're going to have a Seder plate on your table in, March, April, then guess what? Do you want to be a hindrance to that? Or do you want to be a intensification of that? That's the question. Okay. All right. So for those of you who are on YouTube, I will say Shabbat Shalom. And go ahead and end the live stream.